Section 1. A crisis, Pape says, has been building for decades. The conversation opens with a stark claim. Professor Robert Pape says the world is not witnessing a sudden surprise, but the unfolding of a pattern he has studied for roughly 40 years and simulated in relation to Iran for 20. The host frames him as one of the most credible voices on modern war, noting that he has advised U.S. administrations from 2001 through 2024, including the first Trump White House, and helped build Air Force curriculum on precisely the kind of air campaigns now playing out. Pape's core thesis arrives early and sets the tone for everything that follows. Bombs don't just hit targets, they change politics. He argues that modern audiences, policymakers, and television coverage are often hypnotized by tactical success. Smart bombs crater buildings, destroy bunkers, and hit with extraordinary precision. On that narrow level, the strikes appear successful, but Pape insists that war is not just about hardware. Once bombs fall, politics changes on both sides. Target regime adapts, public opinion shifts, incentives harden, and the attacker can become trapped by the consequences of its own opening move. That, in his view, is the central era of American strategic thinking from Iraq to Libya to Iran. Leaders fixate on whether the target was destroyed rather than whether the political objective became more attainable. He says this mistake creates what he calls the escalation trap. Stage 1 usually looks impressive because the military operation works. The problem comes next, when strategic goals remain unmet and pressure builds to do more. Pape roots his authority in a career that began around. Section 2. The simulation, tactical success, strategic failure. Pape says he has run classroom war simulations on Iran for 2 decades, ending each strategy course with the same scenario, bombing Iran's nuclear infrastructure and then examining what follows. He says the latest version took place in May, just before the real bombing campaign. The simulations include actual target sets such as Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan, along with attack plans involving B-2 stealth bombers. On the narrow military question, the result is almost always the same, 90+ chance that the B-2s destroy their assigned targets. But he says that is not the true issue. Destroying a facility is not equivalent to eliminating a nuclear program. The real objective is the enriched uranium itself, especially material enriched to 5%, 20%, and most critically 60%. According to Pape, by last May Iran had enough material for 16 nuclear bombs, though not enough to build them all instantly. The host pauses on that number, repeating it in disbelief. 16 nuclear bombs. Pape confirms it plainly, yes. The simulation's most important conclusion, he says, is that after the bombing, nobody knows where the material is. Not one single ounce, in his phrasing. He argues that this is exactly the nightmare scenario strategic planners should fear. Enriched uranium can be dispersed across a vast country and hidden in ways that make detection painfully slow. He compares the problem to searching across a territory whose size and complexity make certainty almost impossible. From there, he says the strategic logic becomes dangerous. About a year later, panic sets in. The material could be anywhere. Intelligence remains incomplete. Nobody can tell. Section 3. The missing uranium and the collapse of control. Pape repeatedly returns to one issue as the hidden center of the conflict. Nobody knows where Iran's enriched uranium is. In his telling, this uncertainty is not a side note, but the reason the entire operation may spiral. He argues that public discussion often acts as though destroying buildings equals eliminating capability. But the true danger lies in the material itself, and that material is portable. He explains that enriched uranium can be moved in canisters. He compares to very large scuba tanks, transported by truck. He notes satellite images showing trucks at Fordo 2 days before the bombing, and says it would be absurd to assume they were moving anything trivial. I don't think they're moving out the popcorn, he says, using dark humor to underline the point. The implication is that Iran may have anticipated the strikes and dispersed the key material before impact. This changes everything. If the US and Israel destroyed entrances, chambers, and visible infrastructure, but failed to capture or verify the location of the uranium, then they may have worsened the strategic problem. They have now signaled to Tehran that survival depends on concealment, speed, and possibly weaponization. Pape argues the bombings have given Iran every incentive to develop nuclear weapons rather than restrain itself. The host tries to simplify the technical context. Iran was already at 60% enrichment, and moving to 90% would normally be understood as crossing into bomb-grade territory. Pape adds an alarming twist. Depending on the capability of Iran's scientists, even 60% may already represent a grave danger. That uncertainty further fuels panic. The U.S. Section 4. Why killing leaders can make the regime more dangerous. One of the conversation's most striking claims is that killing Iran's supreme leader may have removed a restraint rather than a threat. Pape rejects the simplistic Jenga tower model of authoritarian regimes, where taking out the top figure causes the whole system to collapse. He says many policymakers still think that way because they have absorbed shallow, overly tidy briefings. In reality, revolutionary regimes are adaptive networks or matrices designed to absorb shocks and regenerate leadership. In Iran's case, he says the slain supreme leader had issued fatwas, religious edicts, against nuclear weapons and had done so twice. That means the US and Israel may have killed one of the guardrails against actual weaponization. The successor, by contrast, is described as more aggressive, more deeply tied to repression, and lacking the same record of restraint. Pape says the new leader, the son of the former ruler, had not issued any comparable fatwa and may not even possess the same religious authority to do so. The political mechanism here is crucial. Pape argues that when a leader is removed, the replacement often has to prove toughness in order to gain legitimacy. A weak response risks internal challenges, even assassination. If you don't lash back, how does the new leader get his credibility? He asks, so the structure does not collapse. It reorganizes around harder-line actors with more incentive to retaliate. He adds another layer by pointing to the Revolutionary Guard, estimated at roughly 150,000 to 200,000 within an Iranian armed structure. He says totals around 1 million men under arms in a country of 92 million. Section 5. Stage 1 and Stage 2. The smart bomb trap expands. Pape organizes the conflict into 3 stages, and the first 2 define his model of the smart bomb trap. Stage 1 begins with successful precision strikes. In the Iran case, he points to attacks on sites like Fordo and Natanz, followed by Iranian missile retaliation against Israel. He notes that roughly 3,000 Israelis were sent to the hospital, calling it the most significant such toll since the 1973 war. Stage 1, then, is not stability after bombing. It is immediate retaliation and the start of an escalation cycle. Stage 2 is what he calls horizontal escalation. Instead of only striking back at the direct attacker, Iran broadens the battlefield across the region. He describes drone attacks on Gulf states, especially Saudi Arabia and the UAE, aimed not merely at causing damage, but at breaking the coalition aligned against Tehran. Precision drones hit airports, hotels, and economic nodes. The point, in his view, is to impose costs on countries hosting US bases and cooperating with Israel and Washington. This is where Pape's political lens becomes especially sharp. He says these Gulf states are vulnerable not just because they can be physically struck, but because their economies depend heavily on confidence, tourism, and normality. He estimates tourism contributes roughly 5% to 10% of GDP in some of these countries. A few drone strikes can therefore produce outsized economic and political effects, especially if foreign residents and visitors begin leaving. The host confirms this anecdotally, saying friends are already relocating from Dubai and elsewhere. Pape also emphasizes the gap between regional rulers and their publics, governments. Section 6. Stage 3. Why Pape thinks boots on the ground are increasingly likely. Pape's most consequential prediction is that the conflict has a 75% chance of moving to Stage 3, a limited US ground deployment inside Iran. He is careful to say this may not happen immediately. Escalation, he argues, often pauses for weeks or months, lulling observers into thinking the crisis has ended. But if the nuclear material remains unaccounted for, the pressure returns. That is why he says pauses should not be mistaken for resolution. What would Stage 3 look like? He imagines the US sending forces, such as the 82nd Airborne, to seize and control territory around bombed nuclear facilities like Fordo or Isfahan. He explains this in concrete terms. Think of securing an area the size of Lax with about 5,000 troops, and then holding it for weeks while searching buried chambers, damaged access points, and nearby sites for dispersed fissile material. This is not invasion on the scale of Iraq at the outset, but it is unmistakably boots on the ground. He says the logic for such a move would be simple and dangerous. If airstrikes failed to secure the uranium, and if intelligence suggests ongoing weaponization, leaders will conclude they must physically control the ground. They may also seize oil fields to pressure the regime economically. Once that happens, however, the war enters a new category. The US is no longer bombing from a distance. It becomes an occupying force, even if only in limited form. That shift matters because Pape believes terrorist retaliation becomes much more likely when foreign troops are present, drawing on his work. Section 7. Oil, drones, Russia, and the politics of a long war. Pape widens the frame by showing how regional conflict rapidly turns into a global political and economic problem. A central node in that story is the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow passage through which much of the world's oil flows. He explains the significance in plain terms. If oil tankers stop moving, gasoline prices rise, inflation worsens, and governments far from the Middle East feel immediate political pain. The host notes reports that tanker crews are already reluctant to pass through the strait after one vessel was hit. Pape says that is enough. Merchant sailors are working for paychecks, not nationalist causes, and only one successful drone strike can sharply raise the perceived risk. He ties this directly back to domestic politics in the U.S. If energy prices rise, inflation returns, and affordability becomes a problem, then the political costs of the war begin to hit voters at home. That is another meaning of his line that bombs change politics. He also points to foreign support for Iran, especially from Russia. According to Pape, Moscow is likely providing targeting intelligence to help Iranian precision drones hit exactly the right ships and facilities, much as the U.S. provides targeting intelligence to Ukraine. He says U.S. officials have not really denied this, only softened the reaction. The host recalls Trump saying, in effect, that Russia would justify it by noting the U.S. does the same against them. Pape reads this as tacit acknowledgement of reality. The implication is larger than the battlefield. Russia can use the Iran crisis to bargain over Ukraine, potentially seeking a Section 8. Trump's dilemma, Israel's pressure, and the off-ramp he rejected when the host asks what happens next. Pape says Trump faces a brutal choice with no golden off-ramp. He describes it as a Hobson's choice: accept a political loss now by pulling back, or double down and risk a much larger political failure later. To truly stop, Pape says, Trump would have to do more than announce a pause. He would need to physically withdraw military assets, including aircraft carriers, and signal that escalation is over. Anything less leaves the machinery of war in place. Pape believes Trump is temperamentally inclined toward escalation. He calls him a chaos kid, someone who thrives amid disorder and believes he can navigate it better than others. That instinct may have worked in media and domestic politics, but Pape argues it is much riskier in a war involving multiple independent actors like Iran, Israel, Russia, and regional states. In this environment, chaos is no longer something Trump controls. It becomes something that traps him. He also challenges the claim that the strikes were unavoidable because Iran was on the verge of building a bomb. According to Pape, on the day before the bombing, Trump had a better deal available than the Obama agreement, imperfect, but workable, with significant verification. Rather than continue negotiating, he says Trump discarded that option and moved toward regime change. Pape presents that choice as the real fork in the road. Israel is central to this part of the story. He points to comments from Marco Rubio suggesting the U.S. acted partly because it expected an Israeli strike that would provoke retaliation against American forces.